The clock struck 11 on a quiet Friday night as Michael drove his well-maintained Honda Civic through the outskirts of Pine Grove, a small town where everyone knew everyone, or at least they thought they did. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty roads as he headed home after a late shift at his cybersecurity consulting firm. His mind wandered to the upcoming weekend plans with his daughter when red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. With the practiced calm of a former Marine, Michael eased his car to the side of the road. He had been here before, too many times if he was honest with himself. His hands moved to the familiar position on the steering wheel, clearly visible at 10 and 2. The registration and insurance papers were already in easy reach, tucked neatly in the sun visor above. 2 officers approached his car, one on each side. Their flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across his interior. License and registration, the officer on the driver's side barked, not bothering with a greeting. Officer P. Wilson, according to his nameplate, wore his authority like a shield, his face set in stone. "Yes, sir," Michael replied, his voice steady and professional. He reached slowly for his documents, announcing each movement. "I'm reaching for my registration in the sun visor now." Years of military training and unfortunate experience had taught him the importance of these careful announcements. The second officer, I. Thompson, circled the car like a hawk, his flashlight beam dancing across the trunk and windows. "Step out of the vehicle," Thompson ordered, his hand resting casually on his holster. Michael's heart rate picked up, but his face remained neutral. This wasn't supposed to be happening. He'd been doing exactly the speed limit, his tags were current, and his lights were all working. He knew the drill though, and compliance was key to survival. "May I ask why I'm being asked to step out, officer?" "I said step out of the vehicle," Wilson repeated, his tone harder now. "We received reports of drug trafficking in the area." Michael stepped out slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The cool night air carried the scent of pine trees and something else. Tension thick and heavy. As a cybersecurity expert who had worked with various government agencies, he knew something was off about this stop. The officers' badges caught the streetlight, and for a brief moment, Wilson's badge number triggered something in his memory. A classification code he'd seen during his contracting days with the CIA. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Thompson ordered him to stand by the patrol car while Wilson began searching his vehicle, without consent or probable cause. Michael opened his mouth to object, to assert his rights, but the words died in his throat as Thompson pulled out a small bag from under the passenger seat. Well, what do we have here?" Thompson's voice tripped with false surprise. "That's not mine," Michael stated firmly, his mind racing. "I demand to speak with a lawyer." He knew the bag hadn't been there minutes ago. He had just cleaned his car that afternoon, a habit left over from his military days. Wilson smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You can explain that downtown." The handcuffs clicked shut around Michael's wrists, cold and final. As they led him to the patrol car, Michael's training kicked in. He memorized badge numbers, noted the dashcam's position, and most importantly, remembered that strange coincidence about Wilson's badge number. Something bigger was happening here, something that went beyond typical small-town corruption. In the back of the patrol car, Michael sat straight-backed and silent, his mind already working on multiple levels. They thought they were taking him down, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. His cybersecurity expertise, his military background, and most importantly, his unwavering determination would prove to be tools far more powerful than they could imagine. The patrol car pulled away from his Honda, now lonely on the dark street. As they drove toward the station, Michael caught glimpses of Pine Grove's sleeping streets through the window. Shop fronts dark and quiet, unaware of the injustice unfolding in their midst. But this wasn't the end of his story, it was just the beginning. His thoughts turned to his daughter, waiting at home with her grandmother, and his jaw set with determination. These officers had no idea that their attempt to frame an innocent man would lead to the unraveling of something far bigger than their small-town corruption. The classified information locked in Michael's memory about that badge number would turn out to be the key to turning this entire situation on its head. The holding cell at Pine Grove Police Station smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Michael sat on the hard metal bench, his back against the cold concrete wall, observing everything around him. His military training had taught him that intelligence gathering started the moment you entered a new environment, and this was no different. Through the bars, he could see officers Wilson and Thompson laughing with the desk sergeant, their postures relaxed and confident. They thought they had won, but Michael knew better. He'd spent the last 3 hours watching the station's routine unfold, noting shift changes, camera positions, and most importantly, listening to the stories of his fellow inmates. "They got you too, huh?" A quiet voice came from the corner of the cell. An older man with graying hair and worn hands looked at Michael with knowing eyes. "I'm Robert. Been here 2 days. They found drugs in my truck too." Michael shifted slightly, turning to face Robert while keeping the corridor in his peripheral vision. "How many others?" he asked softly. "Lost count," Robert replied, shaking his head. "But it's always the same 2 officers, always the same story. And somehow the evidence always holds up in court." As the night wore on, more stories emerged from other detainees. A pattern began to form in Michael's mind, a systematic operation targeting specific individuals with evidence that somehow always managed to survive legal scrutiny. His cybersecurity background kicked in, recognizing the hallmarks of a well-organized system rather than random acts of corruption. The next morning, a public defender named David Chen arrived to meet with Michael. In the small consultation room, Chen spread out the preliminary paperwork, his expression grim but determined. "They're moving fast on this one," Chen explained, shuffling through the documents. "District Attorney's office is already pushing for charges, but something's off about the paperwork." Michael leaned forward, his voice low. "The badge numbers, particularly Wilson's. Did you notice anything unusual?" Chen frowned, flipping through the arrest report. "What am I looking for?" "Patterns," Michael replied carefully, years of security clearance making him cautious. "Inconsistencies in the documentation. Things that don't match standard police protocols." As they reviewed the paperwork together, Michael spotted what he was looking for: subtle discrepancies in the evidence logging system, timestamps that didn't quite align, and most importantly, a recurring sequence in Wilson's badge number that triggered his memory from his CIA contracting days. "Mr. Chen," Michael said quietly, "I need you to help me get access to the law library. There's something bigger happening here." Over the next few days, Michael built his understanding of the situation piece by piece. During his allocated library time, he pored over case files of similar arrests, all while making careful mental notes about the station's security systems, shift patterns, and computer terminals he glimpsed through doorways. The breakthrough came during lunch period, when he overheard 2 deputies discussing a technical problem with their evidence logging system. One mentioned calling in their usual ATIG guy, and the name they mentioned made Michael's blood run cold. He recognized it from his contracting days, associated with a private security firm that had lost its federal contracts under suspicious circumstances. Through careful conversations with other inmates, Michael learned more about the scope of the corruption. It wasn't just Wilson and Thompson, they were part of a larger network that extended into the prosecutor's office. The district attorney had never lost a case involving these officers, despite obvious holes in their evidence. Michael used his daily phone call to contact his grandmother, using their pre-arranged code words to let her know something was wrong. She would understand to reach out to his old Marine contacts, setting in motion a plan he was already forming. The DA's offering a deal, Chen informed him during their next meeting. 6 months if you plead guilty. Michael shook his head, a slight smile playing at his corners of his mouth. "No deals. I need you to file some specific motions for me." He slid a carefully written note across the table, watching Chen's eyes widen as he read. "This is unusual," Chen said carefully. "Trust me," Michael replied. "They think they're following their usual playbook, but they have no idea they've caught someone who knows what their badge numbers really mean." As Michael was led back to his cell that evening, he noticed something new. A slight nervousness in Wilson's stance when their eyes met. Word had gotten around that this prisoner was different, asking unusual questions, requesting specific documents. The corrupt officers were used to dealing with scared, helpless victims. They didn't know how to handle someone who acted like he had the upper hand, despite being behind bars. In his cell that night, Michael lay on his bunk, appearing to sleep while his mind worked through the pieces of the puzzle. Tomorrow, his grandmother would make the calls he needed. His old CIA contact would receive a very specifically worded message. And soon, these corrupt officers would learn they hadn't caught a victim. They'd caught someone who could expose not just their local corruption, but a nationwide security breach that went far beyond their small-town operation. The sound of keys jangling and cell doors clanking filled the night air, but Michael remained still, his breathing steady. He knew that sometimes the best way to turn the tables was to let your opponents think they were winning. Soon, very soon, Officers Wilson and Thompson would realize they had framed the wrong person, and their entire operation was about to come crashing down. The jail's law library was hardly more than a closet with a few outdated legal books and a computer so old it might have witnessed the birth of the internet. But for Michael, it was exactly what he needed. He sat at the scratched desk, carefully reviewing his case files for the third time that morning when something caught his eye, something he'd missed before. Officer Wilson's badge number, KS7249CIAR3. To anyone else, it looked like a standard police identification code. But Michael knew better. During his contracting days with the CIA, he'd worked on a classified project coding system where CIAR3 designated a very specific type of operative, ones who had been removed from service due to ethical violations. His heart began to race, but his face remained calm as he jotted down notes on his legal pad. The guard standing by the door looked bored, more interested in his phone than in watching a prisoner do legal research. That was fine with Michael. People underestimating him had always worked to his advantage. "Excuse me," Michael called out to the guard. "Could I get these pages photocopied for my attorney?" He held up several sheets of publicly available court documents, nothing that would raise suspicion. The guard nodded lazily, taking the papers. As he waited, Michael's mind worked overtime, connecting dots that had been floating around for days. Wilson wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was a former CIA operative who had gone rogue, probably selling classified information. The local police department would have been the perfect cover. Back in his cell that night, Michael lay on his bunk, piecing together the puzzle. The evidence planting, the targeted arrests, it wasn't just about racism or power. It was about having a steady supply of arrests to justify increased surveillance operations. But why Pine Grove? What made this small town so special? His next meeting with his public defender, David Chen, proved crucial. "Mr. Chen," Michael said quietly, leaning forward in the consultation room. "I need you to help me make a phone call, not to family, but to this number." He slid a piece of paper across the table with a sequence of digits he'd memorized years ago. Chen looked uncertain. "That's not exactly standard procedure." "Neither is what's happening in this department," Michael replied. "Trust me, this call could change everything." It took some convincing, but Chen eventually agreed. The next day, Michael was allowed to make a call to what was listed as his previous employer's HR department. In reality, he was connecting with Thomas, his former CIA handler. "This is Michael Andrews," he said clearly into the phone, using specific phrases he knew would grab attention. "I'm calling about Project Blue Book, specifically regarding unauthorized access codes KS7249CIAR3. There was a long pause on the other end. "Hold for verification." Thomas's voice finally came through, tense and professional. For the next 5 minutes, Michael carefully laid out what he had discovered, using coded language they had established years ago. By the time he finished, he could hear the sharp intake of breath from his former handler. "You're certain about this?" Thomas asked. "Completely," Michael replied. "The authentication sequences match the stolen database from 3 years ago. They're using police badges as cover for unauthorized surveillance operations." "Stay where you are," Thomas instructed. "Don't let on that you know anything. We'll need to coordinate with FBI on this. It's bigger than we thought." As Michael was led back to his cell, he noticed Officer Thompson watching him more closely than usual. Something about the phone call had set off alarms. Good, let them worry. Let them wonder. That night, the usual sounds of the jail were interrupted by unusual activity. Multiple phones ringing in the office, hushed conversations, the sound of files being moved. Through his cell window, Michael could see extra patrol cars arriving, but these weren't local police. They had government plates. Officer Wilson appeared at his cell door late that night, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. "You've been making some interesting phone calls," he said, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the tension in his voice. Michael met his gaze steadily. "Just trying to sort out my legal situation, officer." "You know," Wilson leaned closer, lowering his voice, "accidents happen in custody all the time. Inmates get into fights. Sometimes they hurt themselves." "They do," Michael agreed calmly. "And sometimes people forget that walls have ears and systems have backdoors, and every piece of information leaves a trail. Isn't that right, Agent Wilson? Or should I use your old CIA designation?" The color drained from Wilson's face. He stepped back quickly, almost stumbling in his haste to get away from the cell. Michael watched him hurry down the corridor, already pulling out his phone. In the darkness of his cell, Michael allowed himself a small smile. The pieces were in motion now. Someone would be accessing the CIA's database, connecting Wilson's badge number to the stolen surveillance program. They would discover the pattern of arrests, the connection to private military contractors, the unauthorized data gathering operations. His thoughts turned to his daughter and grandmother, hoping they were safe. He knew there would be dangerous days ahead as this unfolded. But for the first time since his arrest, he felt truly confident. These corrupt officers thought they were the hunters, but they had no idea they'd actually caught someone who could expose their entire operation. Through his cell window, Michael could see more government vehicles arriving. In the office, phones kept ringing. The night shift was unusually active, with officers rushing back and forth, looking worried. Something big was happening. "Hold on," he whispered to himself, thinking of his family. "Just hold on. The truth is about to come out." The next few days brought subtle but significant changes to the Pine Grove police station. Michael noticed new faces appearing, men and women in plain clothes who carried themselves with unmistakable federal authority. They were trying to blend in, but to his trained eye, they might as well have been wearing signs saying FBI. The morning sun cast long shadows through the police station windows as Michael sat in the interview room, this time facing 2 FBI agents instead of local officers. The room felt different now. The power dynamic had shifted completely. "Your information about the surveillance program was spot on," Agent Richardson said, spreading photographs across the table. "These were taken at different traffic stops across 3 states. Notice anything familiar?" Michael leaned forward, studying the images. Each showed the same model of laptop in police cruisers, all running what appeared to be standard police software. But he noticed something else, a tiny blue icon in the corner of each screen. "That's the data collection program," he explained. "It's disguised as normal police software, but it's actually copying everything: license plate numbers, driver's license data, personal information, and sending it somewhere else." The female agent, Agent Torres, nodded. "We've traced the data to servers owned by private military contractors, the same ones Wilson worked with during his CIA days. But we need your help connecting all the dots." Over the next few hours, Michael walked them through what he'd discovered. How Wilson and his crew weren't just targeting random minorities, they were specifically pulling over people whose data might be valuable. Government employees, tech workers, anyone with access to sensitive information. The drug charges were just a cover, Michael explained. Every time they pulled someone over, that program was copying everything from their phones, their car's computer system, even scanning nearby wireless networks. They'd built a massive database of private information they could sell. His public defender, David Chen, arrived with more news. "The federal prosecutor wants to make a deal," he announced, looking excited. "They'll drop all charges against you if you'll testify about the surveillance program." Michael smiled. "Tell them I'll do better than that. I can help them track down every bit of stolen data, and more importantly, everyone who bought it." That afternoon, Michael was released from custody. Walking out of the jail felt surreal, the sun warm on his face after weeks inside. But his work wasn't done. The FBI had set up a temporary command center in a nearby office building, and that's where he headed. Inside, dozens of agents and tech specialists worked at computer stations. On large screens, they tracked the spread of the stolen data across the country. Michael sat down at a terminal, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he helped them navigate the complex web of digital evidence. "Look at this," he called out, pointing to his screen. They weren't just collecting data during traffic stops. They had a whole network of fake cell phone towers. Every time someone drove through town, they were being scanned. Agent Torres leaned over his shoulder. Can you trace where the data went? Better than that, Michael replied. I can show you how to shut down their entire network. The breakthrough came late that night. Michael found a pattern in the data transfers, a digital fingerprint that led them to more corrupt officers in other departments. The operation was bigger than anyone had imagined. They've got people in police departments across 6 states, he explained to the assembled agents. All former intelligence operatives, all using the same playbook. Frame innocent people to justify the traffic stops, use the stops to collect data, sell the data to private contractors. As he spoke, teams of FBI agents were moving in on other police departments. The network was falling apart, one piece at a time. On the news, stories began breaking about mass suspensions of police officers and federal investigations into civil rights violations. Michael's grandmother brought his daughter to see him that evening. Their reunion was emotional, filled with tight hugs and tears of joy. As they sat in the FBI office break room, sharing pizza and catching up, Michael watched the news coverage on a nearby TV. Daddy, his daughter asked, are the bad police officers going to jail? Michael hugged her close. Yes, sweetheart. And more importantly, they're not going to be able to hurt any more people. Agent Richardson appeared in the doorway. Michael, we found something else. Wilson wasn't just selling data, he was using it to blackmail people. High-ranking officials, business leaders, anyone with something to hide. Michael nodded, understanding the implications. That's how they kept it hidden for so long. Nobody wanted to investigate because too many powerful people were compromised. The Attorney General is personally overseeing the case now, Richardson added. This is going to change how police departments operate across the country. Later that night, as Michael finally headed home with his family, he saw Officer Wilson being led out of the station in handcuffs. Their eyes met briefly, and Michael saw something he'd never seen in the corrupt officer's face before: fear. The tables had turned completely. What started as a routine traffic stop and a racist frame-up had exposed a nationwide criminal enterprise. And it was just the beginning. Michael knew that in the days ahead, more evidence would emerge, more corrupt officers would be arrested, and more innocent people would be freed. As he tucked his daughter into bed that night, Michael felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He'd not only cleared his own name, but had struck a blow against systemic corruption that would have lasting effects. Sometimes, he realized, justice comes in unexpected ways. Early morning fog hung low over Pine Grove Police Station as dozens of FBI agents prepared for the final phase of their operation. Michael stood with Agent Richardson behind the command center van, reviewing the building's layout on a tablet screen. They're desperate now, Michael explained, pointing to the security camera feeds. Look at the server room. They've been moving equipment all night. They know we're coming, but they're trying to hide something bigger. Inside the station, Wilson and his remaining loyal officers had barricaded themselves in the records room. Through surveillance footage, they could see them frantically shredding documents and wiping hard drives. What they don't realize, Michael said, zooming in on a particular camera feed, is that every delete command they're sending is actually creating backups on our secure server. They're doing our job for us, paying all the important files. Agent Torres approached with updated intelligence. We've got movement in the back of the building. 2 officers tried to sneak out through the emergency exit with external hard drives. Let me guess, Michael said, Thompson and Rodriguez. When Torres nodded, he continued, they're the tech experts. Wilson must have ordered them to secure the backup servers. The FBI's plan was precise and coordinated. As teams moved into position around the building, Michael worked with the tech unit to ensure no digital evidence could be destroyed. His knowledge of the surveillance system's architecture proved invaluable. There's something else, he told Richardson, pointing to a pattern in the data traffic. They're not just deleting files. They're sending out some kind of emergency signal. Wilson's trying to warn other corrupt departments. Inside the command center, screens lit up with incoming data. Michael's fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the signal's path. Got it. He's activated some kind of dead man's switch. If we don't stop it, their entire network will automatically dump sensitive data online. Can you block it? Richardson asked, tension evident in his voice. Michael nodded, already coding. Better than that. I can redirect it. Every piece of evidence they're trying to destroy will go straight to the Department of Justice's secure service. The next hour was intense but controlled. FBI teams breached the station from multiple entry points, while Michael and the tech team worked to secure the digital evidence. Through the security feeds, they'd watched Wilson realize his last desperate plan had failed. The files, Wilson shouted at his remaining officers, his composure finally breaking. Destroy the files. But nothing happened when they pressed the delete commands. Instead, their screens displayed a simple message: Evidence secured, FBI Cybercrime Division. Michael couldn't help but smile as he watched Wilson's face on the monitor. The corrupt officer finally understood. His own surveillance system had been turned against him. As FBI agents moved through the building, Michael guided them remotely. Check the false wall in the records room, he instructed through their communications system. There's a hidden server rack behind it. Sure enough, they found exactly what he described. The heart of the illegal surveillance operation. Hard drives filled with years of stolen data, surveillance logs, and evidence of countless frame-ups. The confrontation ended not with violence but with resignation. Wilson and his officers surrendered, their faces pale as they were led out in handcuffs. Their years of abusing power and destroying lives had finally caught up with them. Later that afternoon, Michael stood in what had been Wilson's office, now filled with FBI evidence collection teams. On the desk, they'd found a list of names, every person Wilson had framed over the years. 342, Agent Torres said quietly, reading from the list. That's how many lives they destroyed. Not destroyed, Michael corrected her. Temporarily derailed. We're going to help every one of them clear their names. As the day wore on, more evidence emerged. The hidden servers contained proof of collaboration with corrupt officers in other states, connections to private military contractors, and records of millions in payoffs. Michael's daughter and grandmother visited him at the command center that evening. Through the windows, they could see news vans arriving, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening sky like metal trees. "Look, Daddy," his daughter said, pointing to the TV where footage showed Wilson being led into the federal courthouse. "The bad man can't hurt anyone anymore." Michael hugged her close. "That's right, sweetheart. And you know what else? A lot of good people are going to get their lives back because of what happened here." Agent Richardson approached with fresh coffee and a stack of papers. "The U.S. Attorney wants to meet with you tomorrow," he said. "They're talking about using this case to push for national police reform." Michael nodded, looking at the photos on Wilson's wall. Awards ceremonies, commendations, all built on lies and corruption. "It's not just about catching the bad guys," he said. "It's about changing the system that protected them." Outside, more FBI teams arrived to process evidence. The small-town police station had become the epicenter of a national investigation. But for Michael, watching his daughter draw pictures at Wilson's former desk, it was about something simpler, making sure no other parent would have to explain to their child why the people meant to protect them had become the ones to fear. 6 months after the dramatic takedown at Pine Grove Police Station, Michael stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., facing a packed congressional hearing room. The bright lights and cameras didn't bother him. He was focused on telling a story that needed to be heard. What happened in Pine Grove wasn't just about corrupt officers, he testified, his voice steady and clear. It was about a system that allowed them to operate unchecked for years. Every false arrest, every planted evidence, every ruined life, it was all preventable. The evidence he'd helped uncover had sparked a nationwide investigation. 43 police departments across 12 states were now under federal scrutiny. Over 500 officers had been suspended, and dozens of former intelligence operatives were facing charges. Back in his hotel room that evening, Michael watched the news coverage with his daughter and grandmother. His testimony had made headlines. "Wrongfully accused man exposes nationwide police corruption ring." "Look at the comments people are leaving online," his grandmother said, showing him her phone. "So many families saying thank you. You've given them hope." The next morning brought a meeting with the Attorney General's task force on police reform. Michael had been asked to consult on new oversight measures, using his unique perspective as both a victim and a cybersecurity expert. The surveillance equipment they used wasn't just illegal, he explained to the assembled officials. It was dangerous. They could access anyone's personal information, track their movements, even listen to their conversations. We need to make sure this never happens again. His recommendations were straightforward: independent oversight committees, regular audits of police technology, and most importantly, a system for protecting officers who report corruption within their departments. The good officers were afraid to speak up, he told them. They saw what happened to people who crossed Wilson and his crew. We need to change that culture. The changes came gradually but significantly. New legislation was introduced requiring all police departments to undergo regular federal audits of their surveillance systems. A whistleblower protection program was established specifically for law enforcement officers. But Michael's most meaningful work happened on a more personal level. He started a non-profit organization helping people who'd been wrongfully convicted due to police misconduct. His tech skills and legal knowledge, combined with his own experience, made him uniquely qualified to guide others through the process of clearing their names. One sunny afternoon, he sat in his new office, listening to a family story. Their son had been framed by officers connected to Wilson's network, serving 3 years before the truth came out. "We didn't know who to turn to," the mother said, wiping tears from her eyes. "Nobody would listen." "I'm listening," Michael replied softly. "And more importantly, I know how to help." His daughter often came to the office after school, doing her homework in a corner while he worked. She turned the experience into a school project about justice and helping others, making her father prouder than any congressional testimony could. The final domino fell almost exactly 1 year after Michael's wrongful arrest. Wilson and his core group faced sentencing in federal court. Michael attended, not out of vengeance, but to see justice served. The defendants systematically violated the civil rights of hundreds of Americans, the judge declared. They betrayed their badges, their oaths, and the public trust. The sentence of this court reflects the severity of these crimes. Wilson and his accomplices received lengthy prison terms. More importantly, they were ordered to assist in identifying every person they'd wrongfully arrested, ensuring their records would be cleared. That evening, Michael walked through Pine Grove with his daughter and grandmother. The police station looked different now. New leadership, new policies, new hope. They passed Officer Chen, one of the new recruits, who waved friendly. "The nice police officer gave me a sticker," his daughter said, showing off her junior deputy badge. "That's what police officers are supposed to be like," Michael told her. "Helpers who protect people." At home, Michael checked his organization's website. Dozens of new messages had arrived. People seeking help, officers wanting to report corruption, lawyers offering to volunteer. What had started with one wrongful arrest had grown into a movement for real change. His grandmother brought in coffee as he worked late into the night. "You could have just cleared your own name and walked away," she said. "Nobody would have blamed you." Michael shook his head, reading another family story. "That's not who we are. When you see something wrong, you fix it. Not just for yourself, but for everyone." The final piece of Wilson's corrupt network was dismantled the following week. The private military contractors who'd bought the stolen data faced their own federal indictments. The system that had protected corrupt officers for so long was being rebuilt from the ground up. As Michael tucked his daughter into bed that night, she asked a question that made him pause. "Daddy, are you still angry at the bad police officers?" He thought carefully before answering. "No, sweetheart. I'm not angry anymore. They did bad things, but look at all the good that came from standing up to them. Sometimes bad things happen so we can learn how to make things better." The story of Pine Grove became a case study in police reform courses across the country. But for Michael, success wasn't measured in headlines or policy changes. It was measured in families reunited, names cleared, and trust restored between communities and those sworn to protect them. His grandmother summed it up best during a family dinner. "You didn't just get justice for yourself. You showed people that one person standing up for what's right can change the whole system." Michael smiled, watching his daughter practice her junior deputy badge salute in the mirror. The future looked brighter now, not just for his family, but for everyone who believed in justice.